and they can't see a connection between West Africa and East Africa. So I need to make.
So they believe that the real Africans are the West Africans.
West Africans
and
the others.
Anybody but the.
That's
okay.
right, and that's simply not true. What Professor Cheikh Anta Diop of Senegal, who died recently, was able to show through careful study and through his own personal experience, as well as many others who have studied Africa, is that while you may have physical differences as you move from one African population to another, just as in Europe, Frenchmen and Scandinavians look physically dissimilar in some respects. In Africa, you had physical differences, but you had cultural unity. In other words, the way of life of African people on one side of the continent is, in many respects, quite common to the way of life for African people on the other side.
So there was a thread.
So there's a thread. So I can show this by the kind of migratory pattern that you see here in this slide that comes from the penguin map of Africa, the penguin atlas of Africa. You see what looks like smoke drifting across the continent from the right side to the left side, down something called the Sahel corridor. What that really is a map of population migration, showing that the people of West Africa originally migrated from the east. So it's to be expected that they would share in a kind of cultural unity. Not only did they migrate from the east, but they constantly moved back and forth between east and west, also between north and south. This map happens to be dated at about 2700 BC, showing from the Nile Valley this tremendous migration into West Africa. You can also do analysis of language in West Africa and analysis of language in East Africa, as Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop has done, to show the common core.
People moving back and forth
across the continent. So the idea of separate people on the continent itself is an idea that was introduced mainly by European scholarship, either through misunderstanding or through a deliberate attempt to
divide and conquer
mentally. That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. Okay, let's take a look then after that at the what we can call the royal images and the divine images in ancient Africa. And the reason for showing these divine and royal images is that during the periods that I talked about, the high-tech developmental periods in Egypt, all of these images are the images of African natives, black African natives. And the reason I emphasize the black and the Africanness is that many scholars have said that that wasn't true. They've said that Egypt was white and that it had nothing to do with Africa. And I'm trying to show through these physical images that that is simply not true. Okay. Here's an example of the Sphinx that we all know from the front. The name for this statue is Hor-em-Akhet, not the Sphinx. It was renamed by Greek travelers with a Greek name, which we call it today, the Sphinx. But Hor-em-Akhet is a picture with a human head and a lion's body. We don't know if it's a man or a woman. Some people think it's one of the pharaohs who built one of those pyramids, Ka-af-Re. But the best evidence I have is this may be the oldest monument in the valley near the pyramids, and I think that it would be somewhere close to 10,000 years old, rather than the age that it would have to be the building of a pharaoh, or the image of a pharaoh, Ka-af-Re. Now, if we go around to the side of that monument, which is the theme picture for this series, we see the physical features in even better perspective as far as trying to identify the racial makeup of the population of the Nile Valley. And quite clearly you get what is supposed to be so-called Negroid or high cheekbones, the thick lips, and even with the nose missing, you know, from this angle, you can see that this is a typical African profile. That nose and the beard that were on this statue are now in the British Museum.
Let's talk some for a minute. Why Egypt? About why Egypt is so important. What is so great about Egypt that white scientists, scholars, etc., wanted to make it a European country?
Because Egypt is the oldest and the most highly developed technical civilization in the history of humanity.
From which flowed
the civilizations throughout the rest of the world.
And in terms of achievements?
Whoever whoever developed Kemet or Egypt is responsible for the initial leadership in civilizing
For
the
laying
world.
the
Laying the
foundation.
groundwork for civilization throughout the world. That's right.
And specifically, we're talking in the areas of what, mathematics?
We're talking mathematics, astronomy, we're talking chemistry. Chemistry, for example, is named after Kemet. It comes from chem, or chemistry. We're talking religion, we're talking philosophy, we're talking all genre of literature, such as the epic play, the poem, everything, the arts and the sciences, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, music, what have you. All of these reach their perfection in Kemet, and then were transmitted throughout the rest of the world.
All right.
And so whoever is associated with that is identified then with a particular tradition, and it became Europeans did not want Africans to be identified with this tradition and preferred to identify themselves with it.
Okay.
Right. Now this is an example of the imitation. You remember I talked about the age of imitation being the Greco-Roman period. Here's an example of imitation. Here is an image of the Sphinx, and that's clearly not the same as the one we just saw, which is the oldest. That one that you just saw is at least 2,700 years before Christ, and probably 10,000 years ago. But here's one that had to have been done either during the Greco-Roman period, or in this case, it wasn't done during the Greco-Roman period. It was done as a part of the architecture of the Rosicrucian Museum in San Jose, California.
Yesterday.
Right. But when they carved this image, they carved it in the image of a European rather than an African. And this is how information gets distorted.
Okay.
Remember we said divine images were always black and African. This is Osiris, the first crucified Savior, has the shepherd's crook on his arm. He was known in history as a good shepherd, has the flail in his hand. He was married to Isis, his sister, or Aset. His name was Asar. The Greeks call him Osiris. His wife's name is Aset. The Greeks call her Isis. And their son is Heru. The Greeks called him Horus. The Greeks wound up worshiping Isis, and she became the major figure in European religion up until the birth of Christianity, so that there is an African foundation for the Christian faith, because when Christianity came in, then they had to have a virgin just like Isis, and she became Mary. In fact, the early images of Mary had her looking like Isis.
Okay.
So these would be some of the divine images of ancient Kemet. But some of the royal images of ancient...
On the other one,
Yes.
Isis was shown on television some years ago.
She was shown as a white woman on television here in this country, and looking more like Wonder Woman than like she actually did in her African carvings or paintings. Right.
Okay.
Okay, then we have God Ptah. This is just one of many gods. Again, they look, all of these look like Africans. And most of these images are either not shown or they're shown out of context. So it's a little hard for people to associate the blackness of the image with the civilization of Kemet and that civilization with the people of Africa.
What did the Africans say about who they were? I mean, these Egyptians.
The Egyptians were very clear about who they were. They said, we are Central Africans. They said, we came, our home is at the source of the Nile River, at the foothill of the Mountain of the Moon, which places them somewhere near either Kilimanjaro or Mount Rwenzori. They said that our home is the Holy Land. They call it Ta Necher, Ta Nuter, which means Ta meaning land, and Necher or Nuter meaning God's land. So the land around Somaliland, Punt, in later terminology, was in the minds of the ancient Kemites, the Holy Land. So that was their home, and you find all during Kemetic history their orientation, their physical orientation to the south. They always look to the south just to get their bearings for their map. They also look culturally to the south. And at no point is there any evidence in Egyptian history that they claimed an Asiatic or a European origin for themselves. That's what they said.
Okay.
Right. Okay, we have another picture of a god. This is God Geb. Again, these are divine images, and I could show many. The older they get, the more like African people they are. The newer they are, the more like the people who copied African people they are.
That is, the further back you go,